Okay, so tonight we're going to be talking about the book of Nehemiah. And in order to understand the book of Nehemiah, you kind of have to know the history. So we're going to first look at the history of why he had to rebuild the wall at Jerusalem. And so we'll start out there. We're going to start off in 1020 to 930 BC. You can see this is the kingdom of Israel. It's all one. And this is around the time of Saul and David. And then we'll go to 930 BC. And you can see it splits. There's two different divisions of Israel. There's the northern part, which is the kingdom of Israel, and then there's the southern part, which is the kingdom of Judah. And you can see that Jerusalem is in the kingdom of Judah, and Samaria is in the kingdom of Israel. So then we move to the mid-8th century BC, and then we have the Assyrian Empire. It splits Israel up into different territories. It's kind of hard to see on this graphic here, but in this time period, in 722 BC, Samaria is totally wiped out. It's destroyed. And then we move to the Babylonian Empire. And this is important to the story of Nehemiah, because this time period is when Jerusalem gets destroyed. And these are all of the kings during the Babylonian Empire. You'll see there's Nabopolassar on the top there, and then Nebuchadnezzar. He's going to be one of the most crucial figures in the story here, because we're going to see that he wipes out Jerusalem, and the people are forced to exile into Babylon, meaning they had to leave Jerusalem and go to Babylon. They were captured. So we're going to be focusing on this for a while here. The Babylonian Empire, King Nebuchadnezzar. And how many of you know about King Nebuchadnezzar? Any ideas who he is? Okay, he's kind of a crazy guy. If you read through some stories, he's the guy who's involved with putting Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the fiery furnace. And then, as you know, they come out just fine, unscathed, not even a smell on them. And Nebuchadnezzar falls down and he proclaims that, their God is the true God. But after that, he just goes crazy and he loses it. Back to Nebuchadnezzar. So before the destruction and the exile, the kingdom of Judah had its own language, it had its own army, it had its own king, it had its own identity. After Nebuchadnezzar wiped out Judah in 587 BC, it was all gone. So does anybody have an idea of the reason of why that happened? Like, why did Nebuchadnezzar want to wipe out Jerusalem? Does anybody? I didn't either, but so he was trying to overtake the land. He was launching several military campaigns designed to increase the Babylonian influence in both Syria, which was at that time known as Aramea, and Judah. So in 601 BC, he tries to invade Egypt, and that just fails. And after he tries to invade Egypt and it fails, there's a whole bunch of different parts revolting against him. And after that, the guy who was the leader in Judah, his name was King Jehoiakim, and he revolted against Nebuchadnezzar, and that's why Nebuchadnezzar wanted to destroy Judah. So in 597 BC, Nebuchadnezzar goes in and he just invades and destroys it. He doesn't destroy it completely though. It's still together. It's not in shambles. So he installs his own king to kind of oversee the area. And that guy's name is Zedekiah. But then Zedekiah revolts against him, and then he just annihilates Judah. And this is the result right here. Totally wipes it out. The walls are destroyed and sets it on fire, and everything is, Jerusalem's pretty much plundered. The siege lasted about 18 to 30 months. And after the fall of Jerusalem, the Babylonian general Nebuzaradan was sent to complete its destruction. Jerusalem was plundered, Solomon's temple was destroyed, and the city was razed, pretty much shaken down to the ground. Only a few people were still remaining there to tend the land. And all the people were forced to exile to Babylon. So after that happened, Nebuchadnezzar sends a guy named Gedaliah there as governor to kind of just oversee everything. But then some of the Jews go back to save the remaining people there, and they assassinate the guy. And then they take the remaining Jews that are left and they go to Egypt. So that's just a quick summary of some history. And let's see. So then okay, so this chart here shows you the trip. So it was a long journey, probably around 4 months by foot to walk that far. This guy right here, King Cyrus, this is the Persian Empire, and this is what changes the course of history for the Jews. It pretty much, he enforces a decree or an edict that says that the Jews and the other religions can have religious freedom. So at that time, the Jews are free to go back, and this is where we get into the book of Ezra. And in order to understand the book of Nehemiah, you kind of have to have an idea of the book of Ezra. So we're going to go over Ezra really quick. And originally, the book of Nehemiah and Ezra were actually combined into one book. So before we dive into Ezra, we're going to watch another quick video here. And before we do that, I'm just going to show you this. This shows you the Persian Empire. You can see it started out there, 559 BC. And then Media, 550. Then it goes to Lydia. Then it goes to Babylon. Then it goes into Egypt. It conquers some over there. So these are the kings of Persia, and you can see over the course of time, starts off with Cyrus. He's the one who did all the conquering of the Babylonian Empire. And there's a couple other names that you're going to see on there that we're going to learn a lot about. Darius, Artaxerxes are pretty important figures that we're going to find in the book of Ezra, and we'll get more into that later. So here's the video. It's just going to give you an overview of Nehemiah and Ezra. So that's a lot of information to take in, but we're going to kind of break down the story of Ezra for you a little bit slower than that video. So 538 BC, this guy here is Zerubbabel. He leads the first group of exiles from Babylon back to Jerusalem. Approximately, 42,360 exiles and 7,373 slaves. So when they get there, they began rebuilding the temple 536 BC. So this is the temple. That they're trying to rebuild. And this is another thing that kind of like a realistic model that someone made to try to give you a more realistic view of what it might look like. So we find in this story that, you know, when they start building, they're tested right away. And likewise, with anything that we do when we're doing the will of God, you know, there's going to be opposition that comes our way. So Zerubbabel and his group there, they're put to the test, and some men want to help them build the temple. And it was all kind of you know, their intentions might have looked good, but they really were serving other gods. They were serving pagan gods, so they wanted to bring that into the temple. Zerubbabel and his group got together and they decided not to let these guys help them build the temple. So when that happened, these guys were set out to kind of keep them from continuing to build the temple. So this group becomes troublesome along the way, and they discourage and frighten them from continuing to rebuild. So in the book of Ezra, in chapter 4, it gets really confusing. I spent hours trying to figure this out. In chapter 4, we have some letters that Ezra, who is the author of the book of Ezra, it's written in first person, so he's obviously the one who wrote it. He uses some letters that were written to the king Artaxerxes. Now, if you remember Artaxerxes, he's around the time of Nehemiah. This is the period of Zerubbabel here. Chapters 1 through 6 are Zerubbabel, and that's like about 180 years before the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. So there's a big time gap in there. So Ezra, who's writing chapter 4, he uses a letter that came from the period around the time of Nehemiah. He uses it to explain similar resistance that they endured while building the temple at an earlier time or so. I was trying to figure it out. Maybe that could be our homework assignment. So this is what it says. This comes from Ezra chapter 4, verse 13. Let it be known to the king that if the city is rebuilt and the walls are finished, they will not pay tribute or toll, and it will damage the revenue of the kings. So if we go back to our list here, the temple of Jerusalem was completed in 515 BC, so that would be right about the time, a little bit after King Darius. This letter being used here to describe why the temple construction was halted was actually written to Artaxerxes, who's 465 BC. For the life of me, I spent hours trying to find out how this could be, but I couldn't find anything to explain it. So resistance encourages the king to look in the record books to see that Jerusalem is a rebellious city and is damaging the kings and provinces. So they warn King Artaxerxes, and King Artaxerxes listens to them, and he halts the construction. It's this king, King Artaxerxes, that halts it. Just remember that, because that's important. Ezra chapter 4, verse 23 to 24 says, "Now when the copy of King Artaxerxes' letter was read before Rehum and Shimshai the scribe, and their companions, they went up in haste to Jerusalem unto the Jews and made them cease by force and power." So they actually used force to stop them from continuing to build. Then the work ceased on the house of God, which is at Jerusalem. It ceased until the second year of the reign of Darius, king of Persia. So we see on the list here that Darius is well before Artaxerxes, so it doesn't really make sense. It wasn't Darius II. So temple work resumes after Haggai and Zechariah prophecy. So the reason it can't be Darius II is because Darius II is 423 to 404 BC, which is also after the temple was already completed. So, because it does say in the book of Ezra that they started rebuilding the temple 2 years after Darius was initiated as king. So that would be about 520 BC, and then it was completed 5 years later, so that'd be 515 BC. So the reason they were able to continue the construction was because King Darius the First, he found a decree written by Cyrus. Cyrus was the king that actually, if you remember back to when Cyrus first conquered the Babylonian Empire, he allowed the religious freedom. So he's the one who wrote the decree. Darius is the one who went back and found it, and that's how they were allowed to continue building the temple. So why is Ezra 4 challenging? Well, first of all, we have Darius. Now, there's 2 different Dariuses in the Bible. Does anyone have any idea who Darius might be? Yeah, there's the Darius from the story of Daniel, and then there's King Darius. So the Darius the Mede, which is the name of the Darius from the story in Daniel, he was involved in throwing Daniel into the lion's den, and he ruled with King Cyrus the Great, and that's actually stated in Daniel chapter 6. He ruled with Cyrus the Great. So Darius was around the same period as Cyrus. Okay, so as we said already, the building of the temple was already completed in 515 BC, long before the time of Artaxerxes. And it's even stated again in Ezra chapter 6. It says in verse 14 and 15, "And the elders of the Jews builded, and they prospered through the prophesying of Haggai and the prophet Zechariah, the son of Iddo. And they builded and finished it according to the commandment of the God of Israel, and according to the commandment of Cyrus and Darius, and Artaxerxes, king of Persia." So it groups all 3 of those kings together. But we can see that Artaxerxes is like way down the line, not in the same time period. So if any of you can figure out that for me, I was really struggling with that for the past 2 days, trying to figure that out. But okay, so now we're going to get into chapter 7 of Ezra. Chapter 7 to 10 is when Ezra himself actually takes a second group of exiles back to Jerusalem. Artaxerxes is the king at this time. The time around Ezra and Nehemiah, he's the king. So Artaxerxes is a pagan king, but he finds favor with Ezra. He sees Ezra. He knows that this guy knows the law. He's very knowledgeable, and he sends him there. And he's exceedingly kind to Ezra. He grants anyone to leave his kingdom and follow Ezra if they so desire. It doesn't stop there, though. He gave Ezra pretty much everything that he asked for. That's in chapter 7, verse 6. And then chapter 7, verse 22 says that he offered Ezra silver and gold and many, many other things. He was very kind. He also relieved him of any tax burdens. This is a stark contrast to the Artaxerxes that we see that used earlier in the book of Ezra to describe how the halting of the temple was, whether that's the same guy, I don't know. So the reason why Artaxerxes sent him, does anybody know?
Oh, didn't he find out that was the one who saved them from being poisoned or something? Wasn't that the king?
I actually found that he was commissioned by Ezra by a decree to take charge of the ecclesiastical and civil affairs of the Jewish nation. So he knew, Artaxerxes knew that, you know, Jerusalem was, everything's going crazy over there, they're out of control. The kingdom was in shambles still, even after all this time. So he sent Ezra there to try to get some order, to bring, to get more things in control according to the God of the Jews, to get them back in place. So Ezra, he doesn't ask the king for protection, which was kind of crazy because it was very dangerous to travel that far without protection. But Ezra, he doesn't ask, and there's a reason why he doesn't ask the king, because in Ezra chapter 8, verse 22, we see that Ezra says to the king, "The hand of our God is favorably disposed to all who seek him, but his power and his anger are against all those who forsake him." So Ezra wanted to prove to the king that God is going to protect me. So Ezra and the exiles go and they fast and they pray and they ask God for a safe journey. And the Lord hears them and he protects them. They make it all the way. And when Ezra gets there, he finds that the temple is rebuilt, but the lives of the people are just in shambles. He finds that they're intermarrying with pagans. And, you know, even in the New Testament, in the book of 2 Corinthians, do not be unequally yoked. So then Ezra tears his robe, he falls in the temple, and he just starts crying. He pulls hair from his beard and pulls hair out of his head, and must have been quite the scene, you know. But then people join him, and they just recognize, through Ezra, they recognize their sin, and they kind of rally around him. And the people repent. And of the 29,000 families there that were worshiping in the Jewish temple, 113 of those marriages that were not honoring the Torah, they ended. And this was necessary to preserve the religion. So in 445 BC, this is where we enter into the book of Nehemiah. And so who is Nehemiah? Does anybody can you describe Nehemiah? Anything you know about him or what he did or anything like that? Godly man. Governor. He was not governor of Persia. He actually became the governor in Jerusalem when he got there. Anything else?
Was he the cupbearer? Yeah.
Cupbearer?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's good.
Good. Yep. Anything else? Okay, I'll read what I got here. Man of character, he was trustworthy. He was very persistent, and he prayed. He was a brilliant planner, an organizer, and a motivator. He led the rebuild of all of Jerusalem's walls, and it only took him 52 days. So imagine trying to rally a whole kingdom of Jerusalem to rebuild walls and to do it in only 52 days. That's pretty amazing.
With one arm.
Right.
Yeah, they had one weapon in one hand and then building the wall with the other hand. So he led the nation to religious reform and spiritual reawakening, and he was very calm under opposition. You know, they had some trials as they were building. He was capable of being bluntly honest with people when they were sinning. And we'll start off and we'll read from chapter 1 in the book of Nehemiah. Okay, so verse 1. The words of Nehemiah, the son of Hekeliah. It came to pass in the month of Chislev, in the 20th year, as I was in Shushan, the citadel, that Hanani, one of my brethren, came with men from Judah. And I asked them concerning the Jews who had escaped, who had survived their captivity, and concerning Jerusalem. And they said to me, the survivors who are left from the captivity in the province are there in great distress and reproach. The wall of Jerusalem is also broken down, and its gates burned with fire. So it was, when I heard these words, that I sat down and I wept. I mourned for many days. I was fasting and praying before the God of heaven. So let's stop right there and just talk about that for a little while. So Nehemiah asked his brother, what's going on in Jerusalem? You know, he hasn't been there, but his brother had been there. And when his brother tells him the news, it hits him like a ton of bricks, you know. He can't even stand up anymore. He has to sit down. And he just starts crying. This is a man crying in front of men, you know. It's brought him to tears. And so it's been about 80 years since the exiles first went back there, and it's still a huge mess. And this news is brought to Nehemiah, and he just cries. It grieves him deeply. And why do you think the walls being torn down bothered Nehemiah so much?
I guess if I put myself in that place and I wasn't in America, but being from America, if I were in another country and heard that there was all this destruction, and maybe it made me feel like a part of me was ripped out.
Yeah.
Just like we see the destruction on the TV now.
Yeah.
Of the things that are it's just unbelievably destroyed. How can they live there, and yet there are people in those buildings?
Yeah, like you said, America, nowadays, like, walls don't really mean a whole lot to us. But back then, in those days, the walls were their sense of security. You know, that was what protected their kingdom. It's what gave them peace. And they didn't have that. They had the temple, but everything else was just a mess. You know, their spiritual lives were a mess. The walls were a mess. They could have got attacked at any minute and destroyed all over again. There was nothing to protect the temple. So the walls kept them safe from raids. And he just mourned for the people due to the previous rule. Ezra chapter 4 from King Artaxerxes, which prevented the walls from being rebuilt. This King Artaxerxes is the same king that he is the cupbearer to. So just keep that in mind. So how do we know that when the rule from King Artaxerxes came, did it come before or after Nehemiah got there? Well, I think it came before, and as we read, I'll show you why I think that. For one, it's used to describe the halting of the building of the temple. But for two, we'll get to the answer in a minute or two here. So as we go through this story, I want you to think to yourself, what is the one thing that brings you to your knees? The one thing that hits you deep, so home in your heart that it just brings you to your knees, brings tears to your eyes. The thing that makes you sad. The thing that in the world that you just wish that could be different. Just think about that as we continue through the book. There's so many different things. There's counseling for people. Some people, their thing is to counsel people, to help people. For some people, it's doing missionary work in foreign countries. Other people, it's dealing with youth or street ministry, caring for the sick, prison ministry, abortion, trafficking, comfort for the grieving, homeless, disaster or tragedy relief, teaching, VBS, special needs, writing, men's ministry, women's ministry. There's so many different things that could just be so important to us, so special to us, that bring us to our knees, cause us to pray day and night, and then lead our feet to action. Just continue to think about this, how this can apply to your own life as we go forward. I just want to read 1 Peter. This is from the New Testament, kind of chapter 4, verse 10. As each one has received a special gift, employ it in serving one another as good stewards of the manifold grace of God. Okay, so we'll keep reading chapter 1, verse 5. And I said, I pray, Lord God of heaven, O great and awesome God, you who keep your covenant and mercy with those who love you and observe your commandments. Please let your ear be attentive and your eyes open, that you may hear the prayer of your servant, which I pray before you now day and night, for the children of Israel your servants, and confess the sins of the children of Israel, which we have sinned against you. Both my father's house and I have sinned. We have acted corruptly against you and have not kept the commandments, the statutes, nor the ordinances which you commanded your servant Moses. Remember, I pray, the word that you commanded your servant Moses, saying, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. And they were obviously scattered. So, he's recognizing the sin of his past nation, Jerusalem, and the fact that they were scattered as exiles in Babylon and Egypt. He's repenting on behalf of those people. So verse 9, but if you return to me and keep my commandments and do them, though some of you are cast out to the farthest part of the heavens, yet I will gather them from there and bring them to the place which I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. Now these are your servants and your people, whom you have redeemed by your great power and by your strong hand. O Lord, I pray, please let your ear be attentive to the prayer of your servant and to the prayer of your servants who desire to fear your name. And let your servant prosper this day. I pray, and grant mercy in the sight of this man. For I was the king's cupbearer. So we see here that the first thing that Nehemiah does is he goes to prayer. After he hears the news, that's the first thing he does. So just to break down Nehemiah's prayer, I broke it up into sections here. The first thing he does is he praises God. He recognizes his holiness. He gives him reverence. Then he asks God to hear him. He's persistent. He prays day and night. He confesses other sin, his own and his house. And then he quotes to God a promise that was in Scripture that God previously made to the people of Israel. He then admonishes God's power for his hope in the past, for his people in the past. And then he asked God for his favor as he went before the king that day. So his king is Artaxerxes. Now, does anybody have any idea what a cupbearer did and why that was so important back in those days?
It was basically so he wouldn't be poisoned.
Right. Back in those days, one of the the best ways to assassinate someone was to poison them. So cupbearer was a position that the king, he had to fill it with someone that he trusted. This is probably the person that he trusted most, because this person is pretty much watching for his well-being. So now we get into chapter 2, and we're going to read, we'll start off reading verse 1. We're almost at the end. And it came to pass in the month of Nisan, in the 20th year of King Artaxerxes, when wine was before him, that I took the wine and gave it to the king. Now I had never been sad before in his presence. So we see here that the month of Nisan. The month of Nisan is from the Jewish calendar, and it's actually March or April. So to give you a picture of, there is a time gap here. It's not the same day, it's not the day after. This is actually a few months after, because in chapter 1, he mentions that he spoke to his brother in the month of Chislev, and that is a different month, and it actually translates into November, December. So it's about a 4 or 5 month gap between the time when he hears the news from his brother to the point where he's standing before Artaxerxes, and Artaxerxes sees that he's ultimately sad on his face. So he must have obviously been a joyful man, because the king recognized that he was sad. And then he speaks to Nehemiah, and we'll read that really quick. Verse 2. Therefore the king said to me, "Why is your face sad? Since you are not sick, this is nothing but sorrow in the heart." So I became dreadfully afraid. Anybody have an idea why he may have been so afraid in this point in time?
That demeanor could often lead to death.
What's that?
That demeanor in front of the king could often lead to death.
Could lead to the king's death too. The king is saying that he's sad. He's probably like, "What's up? What's wrong with my cupbearer? Like, maybe this guy's going to poison me, or maybe he knows something's up." But I think that that's not why he's afraid, though. I think he's afraid because he knows that he's about to ask the king something that is totally crazy. Because he's about to ask the king to go again.
He has to tell the king what the problem is. And that's a whole issue right there. He's telling him what happened and why it makes him sad.
Right, and if you remember, this King Artaxerxes is the same one that wrote if it is the same one, it's the Artaxerxes that wrote the rule stating that he didn't want the walls rebuilt. But Nehemiah is wanting to ask him to go rebuild the walls. So Nehemiah is afraid, but he doesn't shy away. So we'll just read verse 3 and 4 here. And I said to the king, "May the king live forever. Why should my face not be sad when the city, the place of my father's tombs, lies in waste, and its gates are burned with fire?" Then the king said to me, "What do you request?" So I prayed to the God of heaven. We're going to stop right there. Nehemiah, he doesn't shy away. He tells Artaxerxes exactly what's bothering him. He's straight, blunt to the point. And if you can imagine, he must have been excited when Artaxerxes says, "What do you request?" That's a door swinging wide open for exactly what he wants, So we see again that Nehemiah prays before answering the king. And we're going to stop right here.